Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and Facebook through YouTube link. Today's episode, just maybe a little trigger warning for those who may have experienced any sexual violence in the past. We're going to be talking about the reporting process for sexual assault, the barriers, the challenges, the realities. So for anyone who has experienced sexual violence, in their life, this may be a triggering episode. So just a disclaimer for that. But I think this is obviously, all of our topics are important. But I think this is a really important one, particularly for our college students to understand the different options they have, because we're going to be talking about reporting. And I think people automatically think of reporting to the police, which is an option, but for college students, they have other options for reporting that I think are important for us to discuss. So where would you like to start? You feel like what kind of reporting path should we maybe start with?
Great question. I think just a FYI, so you said college students have extra, like another path, and I think students in K through 12 schools do as well.
Right. Yeah.
So just FYI, I don't know. We did our whole Ask an Advocate Instagram Live with Title IX. So maybe we start there, because that is kind of one of the first initial specific avenues of reporting that students have. We will obviously speak from the college perspective, I think, because that's kind of where you and I spend most of our time doing the advocacy and in that kind of space. Does that feel fair? Does that work?
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning the K through 12, because specifically for Title IX. So Title IX and judicial affairs, for college campuses or college students are going to often, the offices work together. There is no judicial affairs for K through 12 students, but there is Title IX for K through 12 students too. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, of course. So Title IX is that federal mandate that says that schools have to respond to gender-based violence, whether it's sexual violence or dating violence. It's a very watered down definition of Title IX. But essentially it sets up a framework for students to have the opportunity to say something happened to me on campus or by someone that I go to school with or in this online learning environment. And I feel uncomfortable and I need support from my university or my school. So that is a reporting option. We can talk about barriers that come with that, all those new kind of Title IX regulations that we love so much.
That will hopefully get overturned. So, and that's the thing, obviously, like you said, we won't spend too much time on the Title IX information because we have another video. So check it out on our IGTV. It's titled Ask an Advocate, where we discuss Title IX, the new rules, the challenges with it in depth. But even just generally speaking of barriers to reporting to the university, we're really fortunate, I think, that WCSU, we work really closely with all the different reporting offices on campus, but there's a reason that Title IX has been in the news, for years, and why there have been a lot of conversations around changing it, updating it, whatever. And previous to the Dear Colleague letter from 2011 and even 2014, all that kind of shifting in guidance at that time, schools were really not being held accountable for, their inaction to support survivors, or oftentimes even retaliation against survivors coming forward. So that alone is still, for some students, I think, a barrier to reporting to the university, is that fear of, is my university going to support me? Regardless of where they attend, and regardless of that community, it can be a fear of, is my university going to support me? Are they going to, try to convince me not to go forward with it? Are they going to, not take me seriously? Or are they going to comply with the law? And a lot of times students don't even know the law. And that's why we did the whole Ask an Advocate about Title IX.
Right. And I think the piece of what you're saying too, and is my university going to take me seriously, is a barrier to reporting everywhere, I think. And it's really unique with universities, I think, because you have to continue to go to school there and be in that environment. and I don't, there's the like responsible employee thing and all that stuff. So if now my professor knows, or maybe my coach knows, and like, are they going to take me seriously? Is it going to impact the way that I show up at practice or in class if it's my teacher, or whatever that might look like? So maybe not even around taking me seriously, but now like my community is going to have this perspective of me, or this idea of me with this label on it, you know, because I think there's
Yeah.
so much in society that gives us misinterpretations or misperceptions about survivors or victims of sexual violence and what that means, or what that means about that person. And it's unique when you're on a campus, like, and a huge barrier to reporting, I think, is like, now these people that I spend all this time with are gonna know this thing about me if I come forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I think that's so true for the campus community. It's a community. And so that's going to impact their choice to even decide to move forward with it, and how that process may look for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even moving into the judicial process, if they do decide to pursue that, who are their witnesses going to be? Who are their perpetrators' witnesses going to be? And it can feel like you know, almost like them against the campus sometimes, or fearing of like, you bring this up all the time, of like, victims will often say, I don't want to get this person in trouble, like the perpetrator in trouble. I just want to feel safe again, or I just want to feel okay again. And so a lot of times they're grappling with that decision of, how can I like have this person who did something, a crime to me, and or did something to me that was wrong. It may not always fit into like the legal crime, right, of sexual violence, but it could be a sexual harassment, or a threat of sexual violence, or whatever it might be to their safety. And they grapple with that decision of like, how can I hold this person accountable, or try to work to hold this person accountable, but also feel like I am getting what I need out of this process. And I think that's the biggest like difficult piece of that decision of reporting, can be like, and I know a lot of times we will talk this through with our clients of like, this is, we center around like, this is about you and what you need. So like, if you are going to make that decision to report, it should be for you and like your reasons, and not any other outside influences, or, which is really hard to say.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Like, I'm thinking of well, what if they do this to somebody else? Like, the number of times that I've heard people say that, oh, my friend told me that, or my mom told me that, or I've seen it happen like in the hospital with a victim who is getting a forensic exam done, and the people around them, well, you have to report this. What if they do this to someone else? And like, that crushes me, because it's like, this is about this person right now, and we have to make sure that they have what they need. And I think that is a barrier, right? Is trying to figure out how to center your own needs, like, and like, not listen to all these people, but still get support from people. Like, it's a tricky thing.
Yeah.
And then going along the theme of like, on a college campus too, or in high school even, or whenever, the social aspects of it, right? Like, of this person is friends with all these people, or they're the star athlete, or they're this, or they're that, or they're the star of the musical or the show that semester. And like, what is this going to mean for the rest of the team, or the
Right.
show, the cast, or the this or the that? And like, that is really hard to navigate. That maybe isn't a huge piece, or isn't the same if you're going like on a criminal report and it was somebody that you don't attend school with that was like the perpetrator. Because obviously those thoughts are always there about like, what is this going to do to that person's life, or is this going to change their life? And I don't want to be responsible for that. But maybe you don't notice the impact in the community as much if you're not doing it within the same school because they're a student there, or a professor or something like that.
Yeah. And I think what bothers me the most about all that too is that the burden falls on the victim, as if it's like, oh, it's your fault. And we hear it in the news and the media in responses to sexual violence cases coming forward. And particularly for young people, like high school students with the Steubenville rape case, like that was years ago, but that still sticks in my brain of how the media responded to it, saying, oh, these poor young athletes' lives are ruined for raping this girl. It's like, it's unbelievable the language that our society kind of uses to victim blame, not just for the assault itself, but for like, oh, because you reported it, now it's going to impact the community. And that's so unfair, because the language should shift to be, oh, because you raped this person, you are impacting your community and this individual. Like, you're the one who's responsible. But for whatever reason, we shift all the blame and responsibility and that burden onto the victim. And I think that what you said about like the reasoning for, or people saying, I don't, you should report it because then they won't be able to do it to other people. I think that's often the reason that a lot of times victims do decide to report it, is they finally have come to their decision of, okay, I want to move forward with this. And oftentimes the reason is because they have decided, or maybe other people have told them, but that they are thinking, I want to move forward with this so that they can't do this to other people, which is so just like speaks to the character of these survivors, that they do care almost more about the other people, the unknown victims, than even themselves throughout that process, which is just,
I think,
incredible.
It's different when the survivor gets there, right? Of like,
Right.
I want to do this because I don't want them to do this to another person. Right. Not when everyone's saying you have to do this because what if?
Exactly.
Because that's not fair to the survivor, which obviously we know that. But yeah, like I would agree with you that is a huge motivator for people. Or like I've heard they found out specifically that this happened to another person by the same offender, and that right. gives them the oomph to want to come forward, because that's another barrier that maybe we haven't even said specifically, is just fear, right? Just fear and like anxiety of like, some other people are going to know my story now. Like, this is something that I've held really close to my heart, and I've kept it safe, and I've kept it here. Maybe I've told my counselor or my best friend or my parent or whatever. And now I'm giving it to the school or to the police or to the court or whatever. And there's people out there walking around knowing what happened to me, and I don't have any control over like what they're going to do with it.
Yeah, I talk about that all the time in my classes when we discuss like barriers to reporting of, we don't talk about sex in general in our society. It's still kind of like ooh, we don't talk about that, like that's private, and even when it's good things, like even when it's healthy conversations about sex, it's still like a taboo subject in some way. And maybe with your friends, you might talk about it, but even then there's still these kind of like, I don't know, barriers to discussing those issues. So let alone like the fact that we don't talk about sex in our society in general. And then you have to, not have to, but if you're going through the reporting process, have to talk about the most intimate part of your life, and also probably the most traumatic part of your life at the same time. Like, there are so many layers to that. So when people respond with the like, well, why didn't they come forward sooner? Or why didn't they report it sooner? I know eye roll is the exact proper response, because my goodness, it is so hard for survivors to make that decision. And for some people it is an automatic, like they are assaulted and they maybe go to the hospital and then they report it or whatever. Like, it can be kind of a quick domino effect of like decision making for them. But for others, it can take months, it can take years, it can take decades. And thinking about how we should honor that decision, because it's personal, it can be so re-traumatizing, like you're saying, to share the details of their experience in a public way, or oftentimes in front of the person who did this to them, either in the court system or in the judicial system on campus. So, I mean, that's terrifying for a lot of survivors.
What I think too is survivors have, what I've learned about survivors, in addition to like how resilient they are and like all of these wonderful, amazing things, they're quick to invalidate their own experience, whether it's because, well, I didn't do this, or like maybe I kind of sort of consented, or well, I had something to drink, or so I don't know, or maybe and this and that. And like trying to go through the reporting process, I'm trying to collect my thoughts. In counseling, right, if you're just trying to process this emotionally and get emotional support through it, there's a lot of room and time to be spent on like those stuck points or whatever you want to call them, right? And like as your counselor, I will try to get you to, well, why, you know, maybe, oh, you had something to drink. Okay, like I don't care if you were naked sitting next to the person. They didn't have the right to do that to you, right?
Right.
There's room for that in counseling. But when you bring in the legal system or the police or judicial or Title IX or whatever, and your story gets compared to these rules or these laws that are written down, and if the survivor isn't in a place yet to say, no, like I'm valid for feeling this way, and like this happened to me and it wasn't cool, it can be really scary to be vulnerable with your story when you're still a little shaky in it, and like have to fight internally of like, this is still valid no matter what the law says or the statute of limitations or this or that. Like this still happened to me and it wasn't okay, regardless of whether somebody else tells me that or not.
Yes, 100%. And I feel like that's my other thought in general of like, we talk about all the time, and there's some really great videos about this too, of justice looks different for every survivor. And so, you know, they may choose to go through these systems or they may not, but like honoring where they're at with their own journey and their own story. Like we cannot ever decide what is best for someone else. Like it is only up to them to decide what's right for them. And if they choose to report it, like, and because that feels right for them, we'll respect that. If they choose not to report it, but maybe they choose to, you know, pursue being an activist or an advocate, or, you know, speaking out, you know, using art or poetry or whatever to express, you know, or healing, focusing on their, you know, counseling and everything, like those are all valid responses. I think, you know, society sometimes comes up with that response of like, well, if this happened to you, you should report it right away. And if you didn't, then it's not true. And I love the statement of like, even if you do decide to report it, and let's say the case doesn't even make it to court, or maybe you do make it to court, but they're not found responsible or guilty, or judicial doesn't find them responsible, or whatever it looks like, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Like there are, this sounds really morbid, but I give the example of like, there are plenty of cold case murders out there, right? Where someone was murdered and they still don't know who did it. That doesn't make that person any less dead. So it's the same with sexual assault. Like just because that person wasn't found guilty or responsible or whatever the language is, doesn't mean that that victim's experience is now invalid or, you know, taken away from them. So, and sometimes that can be the reason a lot of survivors decide to report, is just to feel like they're taking back their story, like reclaiming it, or just staking a claim of this happened to me, regardless of the outcome. And that can feel really empowering, you know, going through that process. So I think ultimately it is 1000% up to the survivor to decide what is best for them, no matter what.
Certainly, 100%. I couldn't agree with you more. And I feel like I had a specific thought about it, but like you just said it so perfectly. Like it still happened to you and you're still valid in your feelings and your story and whatever. And also too, like if you still are healing and coping after coming forward and reporting, like that's fair too. It doesn't just take it
go away. Yeah.
Oh, the thing I was going to say too is there are people we know who have experienced, unfortunately, multiple different assaults, and like you may respond very differently to one than another in terms of like what feels like the right next step, reporting or not. And that's okay too. And it doesn't make one experience more or less valid. Like that is all okay. And I think too, quickly, because of what time I just realized it is, maybe not quickly, but there's so many other barriers that we haven't even talked about, like people's different identities, right? Like racial identities. We know that it's harder for Black women or Black survivors to come forward and report because of so many different reasons. People who don't speak English as their first language, or undocumented persons. All of these different minority communities are
LGBTQ community.
Yes, exactly.
You know, by reporting, they're essentially outing themselves if they are not out to some individuals, or that can be a barrier to feeling, again, like we were talking in the way beginning of feeling like being taken seriously, you know, are they even going to be taken seriously because of their identity? You know, are they going to be believed because of their identity? And that can be for LGBTQ identity or their race or, you know, a documented status or whatever it may be. Yeah, absolutely.
And we talked about too in our episode with Dr. Gunter, right, about for Black folks, when they report, they might be aware if their offender is a person of color, like they might be aware that they might experience more violence, like from the police or whatever it might be. Like that's another layer that
barrier.
Yeah, another layer of barriers. And then what else was I thinking too? For male survivors, like people question that all the time, like regardless of just if you identify as male, people you know, have questions about that, or maybe don't take it as seriously right away, which just makes me so sad because it's not any less valid. But I think those barriers, the last kind of chunks that we just talked about, will show up in the school, campus, Title IX, judicial affairs, police, criminal reports, whatever it might be, because that is a part of somebody's identity that follows them wherever they're going, regardless of what system they're trying to report to, the hospital even as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking too, even like the privacy of it. Like we talked a little bit about that in terms of, you know, like intimacy is already private, trauma is very private, but then also thinking about like our younger viewers or the audience, you know, watching these videos, like whether maybe it was an assault that took place in high school, maybe it was an assault that took place when you were a child, like there are so many layers to child sexual abuse as well. Even as an adult, as you're processing that, it can take years to even be able to come to the place of acknowledging that it was assault. And that's true for adults too. Like, I think because we don't talk about these issues as much, which is why we do this video series, is, you know, people sometimes have a hard time being able to label their behavior as rape or sexual violence or sexual contact without consent. And so that's why we want to talk and educate people, because like you were saying before, like even just finding the language in their own story when they're reporting it, they can do a lot of that work in counseling, whereas in the reporting process, there's not a lot of room for that. So if a survivor is not even at a place yet where they can name what happened to them, or I think I hear a lot too of like, well, people go through worse than what I went through. And like that, oh, it hurts my heart because your experience is valid. Like there's nothing wrong with you owning your own experience and, you know, acknowledging that it was wrong, no matter what severity it was.
It doesn't take away. It doesn't take away from other people's experience when you acknowledge your own.
Exactly. And so that's a huge piece to it too, of like being able to name what happened to them, being able to acknowledge that it was sexual violence. That alone can be a challenge for them to come forward. So anyway, that was just another thought I had. But I 100% agree too that like everything we're talking about today, you know, just add the layers of identities for folks who are in, you know, like marginalized communities, and it makes it that much harder. It's already difficult for anyone to come forward, and it's that much harder for folks in those marginalized and oppressed communities.
Definitely. I'm glad that we did this episode, and I know there's probably stuff we didn't even talk about, because what sexual violence, everybody's experience with it is incredibly unique, and everybody's going to have their own unique boundaries, whether it's socioeconomic status or ability to have access to transportation to get to the police station to report if that's what they want to do, or their campus advocate isn't located specifically on their campus. Like there's so many unique layers, and kind of like you said in the beginning, you offered that trigger warning. So I want to remind people of the hotline. If this episode kind of brought stuff up for you, or it's made you think of things, or you want to just connect with an advocate, our hotline number is 203-731-5204. It's 24 hours, it's confidential. You can remain anonymous, but you can also contact us via email or phone at the campus office at WCSU. And remember that these episodes are all recorded and will be released on Facebook and IGTV, but please share with a friend, stay tuned for next week's episode, and contact that hotline if you need anything. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. See you next week.